On behalf of the Marines Memorial Association and the World Affairs Council of Northern California, I would like to welcome you to tonight's program. We're pleased and honored to have General Tony Zinni, who will have a conversation with Jane Wales about his new book, Before the First Shot Are Fired. General Zinni retired as a four-star general. His military service has taken him to over 70 countries. He had 2 tours in Vietnam, which he was seriously wounded. He was involved in just about every Marine operation, including Lebanon and Somalia. He played a key role in providing comfort in Turkey and northern Iraq. Jane Wales is President and CEO of the World Affairs Council and host of the nationally syndicated NPR radio show, It's Your World. She directs the Aspen Institute of Programs on Philanthropy and Social Innovation. She has served in the Clinton administration as Special Assistant to the President and Director of the National Security Council. This should be a fascinating program. Please help me welcome General Tony Zinni and Jane Wales.
In a room so filled with leaders, it's a little bit frightening to single one out, but we're all lucky to be led by General Mike Myers. So. And Wendy is here as well, and I'm just delighted that in the front row is Secretary George Shultz and Charlotte Shultz to greet you, General Zinni. We've just heard the President announce that he's going to be that we're extending airstrikes into Syria against ISIS. Who's with us and who's not in the region?
Well, I think experience should tell us those who are with us or not need to be told what the expectation is. I still stay in close contact with many of the leaders, particularly in the Middle East. And you can't form a coalition by saying, join me, and I'll tell you later what we're going to do and what I expect from you. And that, unfortunately, has been the way this has played out. If you want a coalition, and I think a great model is the way we did Desert Storm and Desert Shield. President H.W. Bush, James Baker, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense. But the first thing they did is went to the United Nations and were able to achieve a resolution authorizing the use of force. There were some limitations on it, but people in the region told me this really gave us cover. We could join it. And then they structured the kind of force they would need. And they asked the regional powers and others outside the region, Europeans and others, what kind of structure they could operate under. We formed 2 structures. We actually formed a Muslim coalition under Prince Khalid, if you remember, that worked side by side and in parallel with General Schwarzkopf. The other remaining nations, Europeans and others, were under General Schwarzkopf. Now that's very awkward for a military to work with a dual chain of command like that, but it was, I think, diplomatic genius in the way it was done. So we built this coalition, and we built it in the right way. That's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, going to the Powell Doctrine, we used overwhelming force, which we should have done if we were going to go into Iraq and Afghanistan in the first place. I think a lot of the problems we have now is violating that. You know, we're the biggest guy in town. Why would you not use your strength? So we had this overwhelming amount of force. That allowed for several things to happen. 1, we overwhelmed the enemy. I mean, that battle took hours before we resolved it and had Saddam's forces out of Iraq. But secondly, it showed our power, it showed our resolve, it showed our determination, and allowed others to join us. I can't understand how we're going to create a coalition that we're going to lead, and we are not going to have forces on the ground. I guess this thing will evolve, and we'll see how it's going to come about. But in my military experience, If you're going to lead it and control it, you got to be part of the fight. And the principal part of this fight is going to be the ground piece. This aversion to boots on the ground, I don't understand. It's another military capability. I actually believe there are occasions when boots on the ground in overwhelming force resolve an issue much quicker. We saw that in Desert Storm. We saw that when we did the relief of the Kurds, when we put boots on the ground, chased Iraq out of Saddam out of northern Iraq, brought the Kurds back home, and then guaranteed their security, then withdrew in both cases, and left a very small force to contain. Saddam knowing full well we could return. We've allowed ISIS to sit inside Iraq for over 3 months now, brutalizing people, committing almost genocide if they could get away with it, recruiting, allowing them to steal the narrative from us when, as I said before, 2 brigades would have taken them out of Iraq in a heartbeat.
What kept us from acting earlier? I've heard some argue that we chose not to really go after ISIS in Iraq so long as al-Maliki was in power. That sense that...
You know, a wise general once told me, if you're attacked by wolves, always shoot the wolf on the sled first, then worry about the ones in the wood line. We had a wolf on the sled, and that was ISIS inside Iraq. We had to get them out, and right away, before what you see taking place, the atrocities, the building up of their credibility amongst the radicals and crazies, the winning of the narrative, the effect of making us look weak, we should have taken them out and then dealt with Maliki. Maliki was a longer-term issue. Maliki is gone. The leverage we had on Maliki is if you want us to help build up your forces, if you want to have the capability of having in Iraq that's a sovereign nation that looks anything like what it is today, then you're going to have to move, and we're going to have to get a more inclusive government. But I think we confuse the emergency part of this with the long-term strategic or longer-term strategic objectives that we needed to accomplish. In terms of building coalitions, in terms of stabilizing the region, in terms of organizing and generating international support for this. But there was an immediate need that we got bundled into those longer-term needs. These were the wolves in the tree line, and we allowed the one on the sled to do damage.
So the notion here is that the boots on the ground, I guess, are the Free Syrian Army. The notion that we would be training them or the Saudis would be training them. Say something about that.
Well, as I see it, we're counting on 3 parts of this boots on the ground, all of which are questionable. One is the Kurdish Peshmerga. And I've been with Peshmerga. This is a different generation than the past. They're not quite what they were before. They certainly have not been allowed to have the arms and equipment because the Iraqi government didn't want them to have it. So they have a major need for equipping and training and other things. They will fight, but they need a lot of help and support. The Iraqi army is a big question, as to whether they can stand up to this. They did not initially. Will they take on the fight now? Obviously, there's Shia militia that will fight, feel threatened by all this, and others that are going to have to be a work in progress in the long run. As far as the Free Syrian opposition groups, we don't fully know who they are. If we equip them and we give them military supplies and support, where does that go? Who vets them? So the ground force piece is the biggest vulnerability in all this. Without U.S. boots on the ground, you're not going to get anybody else that's really going to pony up. And I can't imagine that we, maybe CENTCOM, are going to command a force. Everything the President mentioned that we are providing is support. Mm-hmm. Air support, intelligence support, advisors, equipment. How can you lead a force that your contribution is just support? Mm-hmm. You need to put boots on the ground. And that's what causes others to rally around you and then be willing to contribute. They're not going to step in front, allow you to lead, and only fill a supporting role. I mean, I don't think ever in the history of our country we've ever been in a position like that.
I started by asking you who's with us in the region. Who's with us at home? Who's with the President? Is Congress fully supportive? Where's the American public on this?
I think that, let me give you a scenario, and we've seen this happen with each of the beheadings. The American people have moved more and more in supportive action. Let's say tomorrow ISIS ends up grabbing some poor American tourist off the streets of Cairo, Amman, Jordan, wherever, manages to get them before the TV cameras again, and does another beheading. How many beheadings before we say, if there's an American life at risk, we've got to do something about it? You know, I keep getting questions about what are our interests in this. If you're worried about economic interests or security interests, you're not an American. There's a moral interest here. We can't stand by like we did in the Holocaust in Rwanda and Burundi this time. They almost wiped out the Yazidis, the Chaldeans, the Turkomans, the Syrian Christians. We stand for something in this country. There's a moral, I think, interest in this. You know, we are the leaders of the free world, whether we like it or not. And I think the American people don't need too many more TV images or the potential for that. If we were to let this go by, and we were to have groups like I just mentioned, wiped out every man, woman, and child, if we were to continue to see Americans go through this, then I think it'll be to our shame in the long term. I'm going to go back to something somebody told me one time, and it was the decision that President Reagan had to make about Grenada. Remember, Beirut had just gone down. The appetite for another military commitment by the American people was just not there after what was considered a debacle in Beirut. And the political advice the president was receiving was, do not do this. You know, we don't have interest there. And I was told by a very wise advisor to the president that President Reagan, after getting this advice not to do it for political reasons, said, is there a possibility that American lives could be at risk? And someone said, Mr. President, there's some medical students there that could be at risk. Then he said, this is a clear decision. We go. That's the kind of president we want. That's the kind of decision we want. You know, we don't test the political winds. We decide based on whether American lives, interests, what we stand for is at risk.
So let's talk about, in your book, you start out by arguing that, I mean, it focuses very heavily on those conditions off the battlefield that will then determine success or failure on the battlefield. And you start with the notion of having good intelligence is all important. How is our intelligence when it comes to understanding, now back to Syria, understanding the composition of these opposition forces? How deep is our understanding that would support our notion of having them be the ground troops of this particular battle?
I think this is, first of all, this is a difficult intelligence challenge. I don't want to take that away from our intelligence community. This isn't something that we're used to. Conventional forces where you can establish an order of battle, to use intelligence speak, where you can structure the number of units and equipment and all that. These terrorist groups metastasize very quickly. We saw Al-Qaeda turn into Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and all these other groups, and they're constantly morphing into something else. We now have ISIS, which is the new risen extremist group that probably is going to take over from Al-Qaeda because of its extremism, because of its location, because of its brutality, and it is capturing the imagination of radicalized youth around the world now. And because we allow it to seemingly be successful and grab the battle of the narrative away from us, it will recruit more. And there's coercive recruiting going on in the Sunni areas because we're letting them sit there. I think we lack, first of all, human intelligence. It's hard to penetrate these groups in any major way. Once we focus on them, we get a lot better, as we've seen recently. The numbers have begun to change now in our assessment. I think once we concentrate our assets, whether it's signals intelligence, it's satellite intelligence, it's working with the tribes and the groups in the region that have some insights into who they are and how they operate, you'll see our intelligence ratchet up more. The intelligence failure was we were caught by surprise with this. You know, they suddenly thrust into Iraq and in a very powerful way. I think we had two intelligence failures here. One is not understanding their power and their ability to do what they did, but I think we did not see the Iraqi military's inability to stand up to them.
Right. Right. And of course, that military, I mean, here we are talking about training the Free Syrian Army, but that military had been trained by us. I don't know, how well do we do in training a military under stress in the midst of crisis?
No amount of equipment or training could supplant the thing that you have to be willing to die for. And if the Maliki government could not give their people something to die for, their soldiers particularly, you're going to get the results you have. Yeah. And so I think the biggest failure we had was not in a better military assistance program, more tanks, more airplanes, more training. The failure is we did not put the pressure on the Maliki government to be more inclusive, to be able to understand that the different ethnic and religious groups had to be brought into a power sharing role and a resource sharing role. I was in Iraq right after Maliki got elected. Everywhere I went, to our embassy, to the military, the generals and our ambassadors that were there were many ambassadors, by the way, and to the ministries, the Iraqi ministries, every single one of them, when I asked them, what's it going to take to make this a success, every single one of them says, the Maliki government cannot control power in Baghdad and not distribute, delegate down to the provincial and district levels, particularly in the Sunni areas, and also distribute resources and have them have a say as to how they're meted out. And that's what happened. And I think it's false to believe there was some lack of, we should have stayed longer, there should have been more advisors. You cannot, we should have learned this from Vietnam. You can't have a Saigon where there's rotating generals that commit a coup a month and then ask the South Vietnamese to die for that. You can't ask the Iraqis to die for the Maliki government like you couldn't ask the Afghans to die for the Karzai government. We had better learn that when we go in and we break it, a la Colin Powell's Pottery Barn theory, you own it, and you also own what comes in place there if we're going to get into this nation-building process. I cannot imagine Douglas MacArthur accepting the Japanese to have something less than a full-blown democracy, with maybe allowing some traditional roles of the emperor in limited ways to be part of that, or an Eisenhower in Germany, allowing the government to kind of go its own way and become corrupt or dictatorial or some fashion. Why are we doing it now? Why have we done it ever since Vietnam? I mean, it's unclear to me that if we're going to expend our treasure, the lives and the casualties from our greatest treasure, our sons and daughters who put a uniform on, we ought to determine how this is going to go in terms of what kind of governance system is going to be in there that's responsive to the needs of the people and give them and their soldiers something to fight for.
So as you look at the landscape in both Iraq, well, we'll start with Iraq. Is that capability, that training, that vision for governance present? Do we have leaders coming in the pipeline? Whose role is it to help them move to a more inclusive government?
Well, it's encouraging that Maliki stepped down. It's encouraging that the new government now is beginning to say the right things, but only beginning. The proof is going to be in the pudding, and it's going to be in terms of what comes out of this. So at least the first step has been taken. Mm-hmm. But I want to emphasize now, there's a military piece of this that needs to go on, and I talked about that and what we need to do in Iraq and getting ISIS out. But in order to sustain this in the long run, there's a diplomatic piece. We have to put pressure on that government in Baghdad to become more inclusive and to structure Iraq in a way that can be sustained. It's questionable whether Iraq can stay together. It may stay together, and I've had some thoughts about how it might stay together. It may stay together looking like the United Arab Emirates. There may be a Kurdish emirate, there may be a Shia emirate, there may be a Sunni emirate. They will be loosely tied in a federation. There will be certain powers turned to the federal government, and each would have a sponsor. It's obvious that the Iranians sponsor the Shia and are very closely tied to them. It's obvious that the Kurds have leaned toward the West, and we've invested in them, and they're the kind and the model of the things that we want to see in the region. And even the Turks now, because of economic benefits and others, have been supportive of them. And I think we need to muster the Sunni Arab nations, the Sunni-led Arab nations, to support the Sunni piece, which is the greatest potential for becoming a rump state because they have the fewest resources. So you could sort of have outside sponsorship. You could have a degree of autonomy held together in some sort of federated system. That may not be the perfect answer, but what I'm suggesting is now is the time for our brilliant diplomats, if we have any left, that we might want to be talking to this government about options and thinking a little bit more creatively about how they may keep Iraq together. That's going to be critical. Down the road, Syria is going to face the same problem. I see Syria splitting. I see the Alawites and the Christians with one piece of this and the Sunnis with the other piece. And that Sunni piece, I think, is in line for a civil war between the really radicalized side and the more moderate side down eventually after there is some sort of split that's sort of formalized.
Is there a peaceful way of getting from here to there? Is that conflict between the extremists and the moderates
I think
inevitable?
there's going to be a lot of blood between now and a resolution. Look, we're still suffering from Sykes-Picot. For those who may not know their history, you can look it up. It's the Brits and the French that did this because they carved up this piece of the world at the end of World War I. They put borders and boundaries where they shouldn't have. And because we had this crazy idea that a border represents true sovereignty and identity, and we've held with that, and now we're learning the lesson that that's not true. I mean, I saw this in Afghanistan. I've spent time on both sides of that border, on Pakistan and Afghanistan, up in Waziristan and the Khyber Pass and Turkmen Gate, and I've seen the fact that you can't split a people in half and expect them to honor a line on the ground drawn by Westerners. So we may have to think geography, borders, boundaries, and identity in all this coming out. And it'll be a bloody process, I'm afraid, but there needs to be some creative thinking. I don't think you're going to walk this cat back.
You also argue in your book that not only do you have to get intelligence right, but you've got to understand the context, as you're pointing out right now, the economic context, the cultural context, the ethnic, the historic. Help us understand what the appeal is of an extremist in such a hateful group as ISIS. What's that appeal to young men in the region? And what is the appeal to Westerners who are joining? Well, what's the empty hole they're trying to fill?
Well, and first of all, I would say it's important to understand there are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. And the numbers that flock to this sort of radicalization may be in the tens of thousands totally, and the degree of commitment may be varied. There may be some young men there that are just off to think they're on an adventure. There are others that are in there because of despair. There are others that have been radicalized from their youth. You know, when I was in Afghanistan, I went to Bagram prison, the prison we ran with all the really hardcore cases. And I went down into the cells and, looked at the people we had taken off the battlefield, some really hard cases, many of them illiterate, some of them some degree of education, but very, very few. I talked to the chaplain there, who was an Afghan Muslim cleric, and I asked him about how things were going and what we did. When we brought them off the battlefield, we obviously took care of them. We looked at their medical condition and helped in many ways physically to help them better off. He said, the most important thing you're doing here is you're teaching them to read. Actually, the Americans had a course in helping them read, and they were using the Quran. He said now for the first time they could read the Quran, and some of them were beginning to realize everything they had been told was opposite of what was written in the Quran. So you have to understand that this radicalization can come from a belief by those who impose a belief system on people that have no alternative to understand if it's right or wrong. And if they are under a condition of governance or economic situation that is really bad, this has appeal in some ways. There are programs in Yemen and Saudi Arabia of rehabilitation of people they pick up. And some of them, like the Yemeni program, has a very low recidivism rate, where they actually bring them in and work with them, and it's more of an education process, not a propagandization of them or a brainwashing of them, but to help them through to understand what radicalized them and how to take it apart.
And are imams part of that program?
Yes, they're actually run by imams. Now, I'm not saying that's a total solution. I mean, they have an appeal because there's disenfranchised youth. There's people that feel that their needs are not met, their aspirations are not met. There are people that are just crazy that are involved in this, and there are people that see this as a big adventure. Young people that go off and think there's some sort of a heroic, romantic piece to all this. Some of whom begin to realize later on this is not the case and attempt to come back, especially from places like in Europe and other places. So this is a mixed bag. I would draw us back to the 80s. Remember the terrorist groups in Europe, Baader-Meinhof gang, Red Brigades? They were growing, they were popular. All of a sudden they disappeared. When the people turned against them, when there was a realization this offered people nothing. I listened to the National Security Advisor this weekend on one of the talk shows who was talking about this group being bankrupt. They were offering nothing. There was nothing there that would help these people rise from what they feel was the injustice and the situation they're in. And that's important to get across. I mentioned in the book, in one chapter, the battle of the narrative. The battle of the narrative is important as the battle of the kinetic exchanges on the battlefield. We do not do a good job in this.
In many respects, by virtue of their being joined in battle by the most powerful country on earth, confers incredible prestige. How do we rally our own publics, move forward in as an assertive way as you're suggesting, much more assertive way, while at the same time not conferring legitimacy on the opponent?
Well, I think we agonize and wring our hands too much over that. We worry about conferring something by going out and destroying something that's inherently evil and has done us wrong in some way. Sometimes I think we overthink the problem. We get into these sort of discussions. These are bad people who do bad things. And they do bad things to us. They do bad things to the international community that we, as the leader of the free world, with arguably the greatest set of values and moral position in the world that we try to share with the rest of the world, cannot stand. And if we have to go to war to handle this, and that's what this is, so be it. Why do we worry about somehow us hell-bent to destroy this evil somehow conveys something to them? I think that we get far more hung up on these sort of pedantic points rather than just doing what we're supposed to do and what justice and morality, I think, requires us to do.
So we have some questioners who ask, one asks whether it's wise to bomb ISIL targets or ISIS targets in Syria without any coordination with the Assad government.
I would not coordinate with the Assad government. I would not coordinate with the Iranian government. First of all, understand they do not have our best interests at heart. They obviously, we at this moment have an enemy that both of us want to service in some way, kinetically, preferably. But don't think in the end that this is a kumbaya moment. And suddenly the Iranians and the Syrians and all of us are going to join and have in common some goal at the end. They will play this to their benefit, which will not be in line with our interests in the region. In terms of Syria, I would issue demarches. We are going to strike targets in Syria. We are going to strike ISIS targets. Do not interfere with our ability to do that, or the next visit of a sortie may be downtown Damascus. In terms of the Iranians, since we're on the same battlefield and share it, I think it's important to deconflict, share as much information we need so we don't get into each other's way, but definitely do not cooperate and coordinate with them in any way, or we'll find ourselves in the bazaar and we will lose on the price of this thing.
The next questioner asked about the role for Iran, and I think you've responded. This questioner asks, a powerful question about strategy, fundamental strategy. If we were to put US troops into Iraq or Syria, how do we determine when the objective is achieved? And what is that objective?
Well, the president has said it's the destruction of ISIS. Now, realistically, you're probably not going to totally destroy them. So the destruction is probably the ability for them to hold terrain, to be able to return to Iraq, to be able to mount conventional attacks. I think there are ways you can list what the definition of that destruction is. And so I think the purpose of ground forces would be to contribute to that destruction level, measured in those terms, and to retain a position where they can't come back until Iraqi and other forces in the region are able to stand up and on their own to be able to do this. And I think that, again, a lot of that may not just be security assistance programs for their military and other security forces. It may be more about governance systems that are more inclusive, that have people willing to reject ISIS. There's something better by being connected to Baghdad. In insurgency, what the insurgent wants from the people is one of three things. They want either fear, apathy, or support. And the way you break that down is you take away the fear by the ability to protect them. You take away the apathy and the support by telling them there's a better life on this side. That better life has to be created by better governance. That's not a military task, and we keep forgetting that.
Right. So what would it take in terms of boots on the ground to first stabilize the situation, and then what does it take in terms of nation building to, in fact, bring about some workable government? So even with your notion of, in the case of Iraq, several different states, you still have a process to go through.
Well, you know, what surprised me, you know, when Maliki didn't sign the SOFA agreement, the Status of Forces Agreement, and everybody wrung their hands and, well, we're going to be out of there, we needed more military people in uniforms. That's not what they needed. They needed more people helping them to understand how to govern. They needed more people that understood, that helped them at the district and provincial level, after being given by the central government the authority, the power, the delegation, the resources that allowed them to administer it in a way that was not corrupt, in a way that was responsive to the needs of the people, in a way that they understood. I went through all through Afghanistan in doing an assessment. I did one assessment in Iraq, and I did one assessment in Afghanistan. And one of the things I did is to go down not just to the military units, but to, at the district and provincial levels, to talk to the local leaders. And here and there, you would find a brilliant person, usually a young person, that got it. And I remember one district chief I talked to in Afghanistan that said, and I had a trap question for all of them, what would you like for us, the United States, to give you? And if it was more money and more things, I kind of wrote them off. This one district chief said to me, you're expecting me to say, give us more money or give us more things. He said, I'm not going to tell you that. Teach me how to make a budget. Teach me how to govern at this level. Teach me how to build programs that help the people. That's the investment we should be making, not just more guns and more armies and more police. I mean, obviously you need security forces, but those security forces alone, without good governance, without sound economic systems that are not corrupt, without the social programs that they need to adapt to modernity, are useless. You're just giving them more weapons for the next dictator to use when he comes along.
And the way we're organized as a government, are we organized to do that task? What is the division of labor?
Absolutely not. You know, we keep talking about whole of government. On both my assessments out there, I saw the military doing everything. When I was on the ground for a week in Iraq, and I realized we were running the recreational swimming pools. This is the military. We were running the date palm harvest and the pesticide provision for making sure that it was a successful harvest. The mediation groups. We were running the museums. You know, in Afghanistan, the anti-corruption task force was headed by an Army brigadier general, and almost the entire staff he had were wearing uniforms. There was only one person from the Department of Justice involved in it. I watched the provisional reconstruction teams, the PRTs, that were supposed to be working at those levels, at the provincial and district levels, on teaching governance and working with them on developing programs at that level. 80% military, not counting security. You know, my son, who is a Marine, you know, he spent 3 tours in Afghanistan, tours in Iraq and elsewhere. He was a company commander, infantry company commander in Afghanistan. He called me up. He was on the attack into Marja when they took Marja. And he said, Dad, I've just been given an additional duty. I'm the battalion's non-kinetic officer. And I said, what the hell is that? He said, well, I'm supposed to hook up to the tribal chiefs and the village chiefs and work with them on their agricultural programs and other things. I said, the last I remember, you majored in football in college. What do you know about agriculture and all that? He said, I don't know, but that's my job. Well, I'd like to see somebody from the Department of Agriculture. I'd like, you know, when the first village chief he encountered, he asked him, are you the Russians? And he said, no, we're the Americans. Oh, he said, the Americans, you were here in 1952 and built our irrigation system. Did you come back to repair it? You know, so despite all the narrative and the messaging and everything else, those village people didn't understand who this armed force was coming into the village. And our uniformed military are out there trying to do things, putting their heart and soul in it, God bless them, but trying to do things they're not trained and equipped for. We don't have a whole-of-government approach. We don't have a planning culture in the rest of them. We don't have the ability to operate and perform at that scale to rebuild nations. USAID and others are wonderful at the village level. We don't invest in a deployable capability to be able to embrace this at this level. You know, if you go to the United States Central Command, the United States Pacific Command, United States Southern Command, or any of the rest of them, and you ask to see their war plans, you will see a war plan. You will see a war plan for North Korea. You'll see a war plan for Iran or any other threat. You will not see a plan for reconstruction. It doesn't exist. You know, so we know how to break it. We don't know how to put it back together.
And as you look forward, not just in this region that you know so well, but even beyond, aren't these the kinds of conflicts and the kinds of dangers we're going to face? Is it going to be more about weak states collapsing than about strong states using force?
It's going to be more about weak states collapsing. It's going to be more of this kind of instability. And the problem is that in the good old days, you could avoid it. You could be isolationist. You could hide behind 2 mighty oceans and not worry about it. But now, even weak states in remote areas become sanctuaries. The problems that come out of those sanctuaries, the evil, the cancer that comes out, metastasizes and grows. We could see this happening in Africa and Yemen and Somalia and places like that allow them to grow and get larger. You know, the pirates in Somalia that interdict trade. We saw in Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan that they had a global reach in what they could do and can even reach into our own communities and radicalize youth that, you know, happen to be living there. So the world has shrunk. We're a globalized world. And so even though it seems so remote, so obscure, so much out of what it seems that should affect our interests in the way we measure physical interests, I think we have to realize in this kind of environment we're in now, in this world that we're in now, with information technology, with our ability to move about the globe so freely, with interconnected economic systems, governance systems, and everything else, that there's no part of the world that's not relevant. And so when it gets destabilized in some way, the world has got to draw attention to it and do something about it. Our job in this world, and this is, I don't think since the end of the Cold War, we've ever thought about this world order or disorder as it is now. It is a very different world. We still operate, it's like the Cold War era, and it's not. We don't understand this world. We've never built a strategy to deal with it. We've never identified our purpose and our power in this world. And that's something that's long overdue that we need to understand. You know, this ridiculous talk that, well, Americans want to go back to be more isolationist or removed from the world. I'm sorry, but that train has left the station.
The last time we had the kind of all-of-government response that you're talking about is really the Marshall Plan. Do you have any more recent examples, or should we be in sort of organizing ourselves around that kind of mission? Maybe not that level of commitment, but that kind of role.
That era was the greatest strategic moment in the history of the United States, the post-World War II era, from 45 to 50. It was not only the European Reconstruction Plan, the Marshall Plan, which, first of all, 19% of the American people approved of it at the beginning. But because of 80-some speeches with George Marshall and the support, he got support behind it. That era, 1947, we passed the National Security Act. We reorganized the government to face a new world. That's the last time we did it. Since 1947, our government's become a bloated bureaucracy that no businessman would ever operate on the structure we have in the government. Patronage, pork has guided everything. There's no strategic thinking. The Kennons are gone, the Marshalls are gone, and we've never really replaced them in any measurable way. We created the IMF, the World Banks. We created NATO. It was a remarkable short half-decade when we thought strategically. And oh, by the way, it was a Republican Congress and a Democratic administration that weren't too happy with each other, but for the good of the nation came together and got that done. Try that today.
And it wasn't quite under the glare of the Klieg lights that we have now also. So there are some key differences, but those differences are opportunities. The information age is filled with opportunity.
But I would say it was a more dangerous time. We had just come out of a world war. We had a devastated Europe, a devastated Asia. We had a rising threat of communism, the Soviet Union, Red China. It was a very dangerous period in our time. We had a transition over. And I think that, you know, look, all the threats we have now are nowhere near the danger of the moments we had during the Cold War and certainly at the beginning of the Cold War. And so, you know, I would think we were able to rise to the occasion then, and I think we've lost our way. We've lost our way strategically. We don't think that way anymore. We've lost that way, our way as a nation, in that even though we could have political differences, we can work together. We have allowed the worst parts of politics, patronage, pork, and the other things that should have been long gone from our system, building bloated bureaucracies. We've allowed that to constipate our government in the way we do business.
There are a couple of questions about the financing of government. And one mentions that their son is in the military, and she is worried that he will not have the support he needs, that the investments in the military are going down, and that's an area of concern. And another questioner asks whether we're ever willing to finance diplomacy.
Well, to take the last one first, we haven't been willing to finance diplomacy, unfortunately. Our foreign aid budget is woefully inadequate for what we need to do. People don't understand what it goes for and how it needs to be effectively administered, and where we can put our money to do greater good. We always lean toward the military to resolve problems. We have an over-militarized foreign policy. Both Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates said that jointly after that. Financing of the military, look, you're never going to be able to afford the perfect military to handle all threats. There's never been a case in our history we've been able to do that. You have to understand where to take risks. We are now in a situation where we are taking grave risks. We have cut our military. Now, I understand the economics of this, the first one to do it. I've seen this from both sides, from the defense industry and from the military side. We are taking grave risks. I would like to see us, if we're going to take these risks based on affordability, that they be based on strategic understanding of those risks. Unfortunately, these are political decisions. I have yet to see any congressman or senator who has read the National Security Strategy. Not that it's a great document, but you know, the decisions that they make whether to support a program or not are usually based on whether it's built in their district or not, or they have a tendency to want to support it. That's a hell of a way to run the railroad. And you know, oftentimes with things that the military asks for, they're not granted, and things they don't want are given to them. So as much, we have to watch, you know, what we invest in and where we decide to take the risk, but there needs to be, more importantly, a process for understanding how we make these investments. And it has to have a strategic underpinning or foundation. That's absent in this whole process.
It seems that every president goes to office intending to do just that. and then gives up about a year or two in. What are the forces that make that so difficult? Is it the way Congress makes its
I blame
decisions?
all of us. We always want to elect somebody that runs, quote, against Washington. Ever since and including Jimmy Carter, there's only been one president that really understood Washington, George H.W. Bush. He was a congressman, he was the head of the CIA, he was a cabinet member. Everybody else came from outside. And if you listen to the campaigns, it is sweet music to us to hear they're going to run against Washington. And then as soon as they come into Washington, they don't understand how it works. They can't get anything done. They end up in a dispute, you know, the executive branch with the legislative branch. You know, it's become more poisonous. I'm listening to the Caro audio tapes now on the life of LBJ.
He understood Washington.
He understood Washington. And you know, guys like Tip O'Neill, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and many from both parties, if you go back, as much as the good old boys did work in the back room, we got the 80% solution and things moved on. I'm not saying that was perfect, but I'm saying that this government can't work the way it is now going. It can't work with all or nothing, with willingness of our political leaders to commit suicide to ensure nothing that gets done. In the end, we suffer as a people, we suffer as a nation. That whole atmosphere is poisonous and has to change.
As you think about the various presidents that you've seen pretty up close, you've advised in some ways, you've been engaged in so many of the major events of our recent history. Talk a little bit about their different decision-making styles.
Well, I think when a president comes into office, the president has to figure out right away how he or she will receive advice. This is the critical part of the initial stages of any administration. And it's interesting, when in researching the book, I went back and looked at how this was done. Eisenhower, for example, created the Solarium Group. He and Dulles put together a smart group of people who didn't agree with each other, but the likes of Kennan and several others. And he wanted them in to express their views and opinions and debate each other. He sat there and wouldn't speak. He wouldn't even question or comment. He just took notes. Wanted to hear the debate. We know that there are other presidents that had strong reliance on individuals. Wilson with Colonel George House. We had, you know, we know the Kissingers and the Brzezinskis and the magnificent Secretary of State we have sitting here who was so influential. So there may be somebody who is what I would title a wise man that may carry the discussion. Others have relied on the structure, the National Security Council as a group, or even their cabinet. I don't think there's one solution. I think it's a style issue. But where I've seen us go off track is when presidents have allowed their advice and their options and their analysis to be given by either individuals or groups that influence them and head them in one direction without the debate and without presenting alternatives and making sure the president sees all sides. The debate doesn't go on. I think when we went into Iraq, we didn't allow the debate. And I blame the opposition party. I blame the administration for not opening up and listening to those that had voices that were of caution about what they were trying to do. So this process, which is so personality dependent, has got to be done in a way where the president can hear all sides of the debate. And I would carry it over to another important, very important lesson. Your intelligence that you receive, the facts, the information that are going to be the basis for your decision after you analyze it and, you know, and promote it into something that's wisdom or knowledge, have to be presented in a way that they understand what you intend to do with it. Mm-hmm. If you go to the Director of Central Intelligence and you say, for example, this is a hypothetical case, I'm going to go to war. Give me some justification for it. You might get one answer. If you went to them and said, I need to know if this justifies war. Is there a case for war here? I did work for the CIA on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There was never any credible evidence of an ongoing program. Now, how did we go to war on that basis? I threw a fit at Langley. I describe it in the book over this. How did we end up going to war on that basis? If you went to war on another basis, it was going to be a strategic move, implant democracy, or whatever we think, just like dominoes falling in Southeast Asia. That may be one thing. But to base it on something that fundamentally and factually wasn't there, you have to wonder, how did that happen? The second thing that amazed me about that whole process is in 1999, when I asked all the intelligence agencies in the intelligence community to tell me if we were to go into Iraq, what we would find, predicted everything. You don't control the borders, you're going to have bad, evil things come across, and they describe them. If you don't control the population when you roll them back, that population is going to go at each other, Sunni against Shia, Kurd against Arab, and you're going to have a mess. And my understanding of that had me build a plan that required 380,000 troops if you were going to go into Iraq. And yet, just 2 years later, all of a sudden, we were hearing this is going to be a cakewalk. It's going to be a liberation. There'll be flowers in the street. All those phrases were coming out. How did we go from what I heard in '99 to what we did when we went into Iraq? There's a disconnect. Either the intelligence changed, or we cherry-picked it, or we asked the wrong questions. And so that's the other part of the presidential process of understanding what he's getting into. He has to be objective, clear-minded. He has to make sure that he doesn't have a preset notion of what he thinks should happen before he's seen all the arguments, all the options, all the intelligence in its best objectivity.
Does the Obama administration right now, actually, let me just backtrack, because you're talking about a situation in which we were perhaps too eager to go to war, to find the justification or to minimize the risk. Do you worry that the Obama administration, on the other hand, is too worried about going to war, too anxious to avoid ever having boots on the ground?
Yes, I am. I think they're overly cautious. I mean, I listen to the president, and certainly I respect the office of the president. I think I met President Obama one time. He asked me to tell him about Iraq when he first came into the Senate, and I spent hours with him. He's an intelligent person, and I think he loves his country and wants to do right. I think he genuinely does not want to see our country immersed in mired down in long-term conflicts that go nowhere. I appreciate that. But he's asked to understand we're the most powerful nation in the world. We are the leader of the free world, that there are times when our interests or our values are challenged, and you must respond to those. And you can't base that response on the political winds of the moment. Sometimes you'll have to make decisions that may not be popular right away. Your job is to use the bully pulpit to explain those and to bring the American people along. That's critical. But if every decision is going to be made by first taking a poll or a survey or determining what the feeling is out there, then something's wrong. You know, my daughter once said to me, I want to feel like my father's in the White House. Now, she didn't mean that literally. She made that clear. But what she was saying was what I hear by people. I want to know that the person up there has the judgment. I may not have all the information. I may have something that I'm inclined to believe, but I want to trust that that person has the knowledge, the wisdom, the stature, the presence, the force of will to do the right thing and make the hard decision. And that decision may not be popular, but if in the mind of that president it's right and it's the thing we need to do, that's why we elect our officials, to gain more knowledge and deeper understanding. We have become a nation of polls. Look how fast American support for action changed with a couple of incidents. 3 beheadings, as tragic as they were, 3 beheadings moved us from 30% support to 71 or something like that in terms of taking action. You know, so the president can't be testing polls and political will or taking surveys in making a decision. It's the right and the wrong. It's the Reagan question, are American lives at risk? And if they are, the decision is clear. I mean, that's where we have to be. Your job is to bring the American people along. I have a whole chapter in the book called My Fellow American speech. My father listened to FDR on those fireside chats every night. He knew what we were doing. The entry into the war, obviously after Pearl Harbor, what we were intending to do, we brought the people along. We kept the people involved. We helped them understand what the good things and the bad things were, but what our objectives are and where we were headed. That's the job of that office.
And if anybody had the opportunity to have a conversation with the American people, it's President Obama. It's somebody right in the middle of the information age. Tell us one more thing about his decision-making. I think, although he's viewed as deliberate and cautious, in fact, he does have comfort with risk. And I'm thinking about Abbottabad. I'm thinking about the raid of bin Laden's compound, when he was, in fact, advised by both Secretary Gates and by the Vice President not to act. I think they both had memories of what had happened with the Iran hostage rescue attempt under Jimmy Carter, and said, you don't want to repeat that. What did you learn about Obama, about President Obama in that?
Well, I want to take a different tack. How could you have not done it? If somebody walks in and says, we think we know where he lives, we've got eyes on target, there he is. Could you imagine him saying no, and then later on, Osama bin Laden got away? I mean, for not doing it, I don't think there was any choice in this. I don't think it was a bold move or a risk. I think you had to do it. Jimmy Carter had to do what he did. Unfortunately, we didn't have the capability then to execute the mission. But you have to do it. I remember when we struck with T-LAM missiles right after the bombings of our embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam up into the camps in northern Afghanistan. We knew there was an outside chance Osama bin Laden might be there. I mean, the probability was almost nil. There was a slight chance. And if we didn't, the president at that time, President Clinton, knew, we'll take heat. We will have shot those missiles. We'll knock out some jungle gyms up there, and, and they'll criticize for it. But he knew we could not take the shot, and he took it. I mean, that's what you do. It's not a brilliant, a tough decision to decide to do it. If somebody walks in and said the most evil man on this planet who destroyed American lives and attacked us in our own homeland may be here, what other choice do you have?
We have two or three questions that are outside of the region, so I just want to make sure that we get to them before we end. 3 or 4 people have written in asking about Ukraine and asking about Russia, and I think the way I'd kind of sum them up is, gee, we at the moment that George Shultz was Secretary of State, we were moving to the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of a potentially very, very good relationship with Russia and with the successor states. How did we get where we are? And what role might the decision under Clinton to expand NATO to include Warsaw Pact countries but not invite in Russia, what role might that have played in the relationship? I
was in Europe when the wall came down. And Secretary of State James Baker said, we need to connect to Russia, the former republics, and to Eastern Europe. He assigned Ambassador Rich Armitage and a team, where they talked about a potential international Marshall Plan. We emptied our war stocks for the Cold War, medical supplies and everything, brought them to Russian and the other republics' orphanages and other places. I worked with Rich Armitage in connecting to all the ministries in Russia and the other republics on helping them meet international auditing standards, trying to work them toward a convertible currency. I thought a convertible ruble was a car until Armitage schooled me in. And General Jack Galvin, who was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, said it's critically important that the Russians don't feel there are winners and losers in this. Mm-hmm. We've got to convince them that everybody's a winner, particularly the Russian people. The number one connection he wanted is us to connect to the Russian military. We sent a number of us NATO generals. went to Russia, went to Moscow. They came to us. We ran a series of conferences talking, and this was a conversation about how a military functions in a democracy. The time I spent in Russia, I actually had a Russian aide, a cadet from the propaganda corps. His name was Vlad. Perfected his English by listening to Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. But that effort was on track. The effort was, we are going to bring everybody into a collective feeling that we've just transitioned through something. It wasn't a war. We didn't win or lose. It might have been a Cold War in name, but we've evolved into something better. That effort just sort of faded away. The military connection, the political and diplomatic and economic connections. It was even difficult, I know, in working with Rich Armitage, to get the Europeans to really get motivated to support this. And then the next thing that happened is we took the Warsaw Pact countries and rushed them into NATO. NATO without a mission or a purpose. Eastern European countries that came in that didn't live up to the requirement, the military standards. We went from 16 countries to 28. This was an in-your-face to the Russians. If there was nothing else that could have built this sense of nationalism and resentment, that was it. It gave birth to this throwback, Putin, to come into a place like that. Putin is trying to do two things right now. I don't think he wanted Ukraine, but it was dropped at his doorstep, and he's going to exploit it. He wants to, one, test American leadership in Europe and NATO. How strong is it? And he's going to push it to see how far it goes. Secondly, and most importantly, he's testing European resolve and commitment. Would they be willing to go the extra mile on sanctions, even if it hurt them economically? And he'll push this until he sees American leadership is strong, European resolve and commitment is strong. If he sees that, then the next diplomatic move has to find a way where nobody loses face and we walk this thing down. That's going to take a deftness and diplomacy that I hope we have and the Europeans have and the Russians have.
I see Mike in the wings, so I know that it's time to close, but I just have to read you these last two questions, and I do expect an answer. The first is, might you run for office? And
no.
The second is, and this person is not asking about dog catcher. The second is, would you be willing to run for president?
No. No.
Please join me in thanking General Zinni.
General Zinni, thank you so much. Jane Wills, thank you so much. Fascinating program.